Harvey Jacobs with us. He's a professor at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Gillard Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies, Madison. He's an expert on private property rights, social conflict over public regulation of property, public policy for private property, and has, to his credit, several achievements. So we're really happy to have you with us. Thank you for your time.
Professor Jacobs, we understand that the environment has a strong influence on how policy rights are made, how the policy space really works. Do you think the nature of property rights are going to change in this regard?
I think absolutely. I think there's no question that as we have a more interconnected and global conversation about sustainability and what sustainability actually means, that there is going to be an ever-increasing skeptical look at the notion of what it means for someone to own and control land. The current concept of property that exists in many of the English legacy countries is a concept invented in the 18th century. And we don't dress like we dressed in the 18th century. We don't eat. We don't live in houses. We don't transport ourselves as we did hundreds of years ago. Why do we have the same property system? And I think that property system has to transform. And we know that it's possible for it to transform. We know it has done so in the past. And I think that global concern about sustainability in many forms is going to push on that property system to transform again. And I think that one of the most pressing issues is really going to be about the issue of property and climate change. So we are seeing a lot of discussion, again, globally, from the Pacific nations, the island nations of the Pacific, to places like the Netherlands, back to the United States, where we are a huge country, and yet the majority of the population actually lives within a very thin strip on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. If you begin to have serious rising sea levels, what does that mean for who owns what they can do with it, what's the right of the state to intervene, to manage that? Right now, we are using very old ideas. And so I think that the environment, the notion that nature itself may have rights which it may claim, or we would act as its voice to claim, is something where we have already begun to discuss, and we will see brought forth again. So let me just note, for example, 100 years ago, if you would have argued that a child an infant child who could not even speak, could be embodied with rights of its own in some fashion, people would not have understood what you're thinking about. And yet now, globally, we have a legal system which allows legal guardians, to be appointed to children to represent their best interest. We have a set of environmental ethicists, environmental lawyers, environmental planners, environmental policy analysts who say, why don't we do the same thing for forests, for mountains, for landscapes, for seashores, for things which are unique and things which are essential?
But don't we have something similar to it already? Government, I think, world over acts like a public trustee to the environment. So isn't the government kind of responsible for representing the environment too, in that case?
Yes and no. I think that we have a situation, and it varies tremendously globally, where government is supposed to represent the public interest and is supposed to act on behalf of the public interest with regard to a broad range of environmental resources, water, air, forest, etc. But the ability of government to do that is often constrained by the legal and policy structures which come to embody property and people's sense of what's mine, what can I do with it, to what extent can government restrain me before government might have to pay me. So, and again, this has been a very complicated and ever-evolving conversation globally, and it has taken different forms in different countries. But I guess I'll give you the counterfactual. If this was true, what you assert, would we have the extent of environmental degradation we have? No. So we could argue that government, I mean, the answer to my question might be no, government doesn't actually have the authority, or we might argue government has the authority but is not effectively using it. And I think it is both. But I think there's actually a fair amount of confusion as to whether government has that authority, even when we say it does.
As a final question, as part of this interview, how do you think the property rights bundle is going to look like for the developed world in, say, 2050? And how do you think it's going to look like for India in specific?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Because I start from the position that we know that property has changed over 50 and 100, and 100 to 150 years, very specifically. So if we look to the future, we can hypothesize that it will change again. And the question is, how will it change? I think, relative to the environment question, I think that more elements of the natural world, be they animals, plants, landscapes, will gain a sense of their own right to exist outside the right of a human being to assert that this is mine and I can do what I want with it. I think that the second thing which is going to occur, which actually fits with that, but goes back to our urbanization question, is we can understand that the rise of government's role to manage urbanization, the rise of urban planning, the rise of urban management instruments like zoning, actually came about as a result of the beginning of 20th century urbanization. So if we're going to see more urbanization, I predict we're actually going to see a shrinkage of the bundle precisely because all of us will look to government to take on a stronger role. I was visiting with some people at lunch today, and I said that what gives rise to urban management regulations is the simple situation of everybody trusts themselves to be a good land manager, but nobody trusts their neighbor. And so we look to government to be the mediator between us and our neighbors. At the same time, so I think those are two big changes. We'll see nature get stronger roles. We actually will see government get a stronger role. But at the same time, I think one thing that is not going to change is that I think individuals' ability to stand at the front door of their flat, of their home, and to say, this is mine. I can decide whether you may come in or not. And I can do that for a variety of reasons, is something that will continue. So we have a global respect for people's homes. And I think that respect will continue. Now, what is this going to mean for India? I think India is going through an extremely difficult land use and demographic transition. But I actually think there's something very interesting going on in India. And I think what's interesting is how incredibly aware everyone is of the problems. Everyone. There's nobody who isn't aware, whether it's traffic or garbage or, right? And nobody likes it. Now, the problem is many people don't like it and think there's nothing to do about it. You just can't fix it. It's just the way we have to live. But I think there's another group of people who have the power of imagination and say, yes, we can imagine a different world. And I think that India is right at that point. And I want to be hopeful. I want to say the India of the future, that when all of you are my age, we'll look back on India, and India will have begun to more successfully gotten control of its cities and its ability to provide a range of public goods for people in those cities in a way that people are actually satisfied with their lives.